Insanity, the Idea and Its Consequences, by Thomas Szasz. What a thing means is simply what habits it involves. There is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. Charles S. Peirce. While the consequences of the thesis I argue in this book are complex, its crux is simple. Absent an agreement on an unambiguous definition of the concept of bodily illness, the concept of mental illness is an empty vessel. Since the 19th century, when medical science embraced the definition of disease as bodily lesion, the main object of medical research has been to identify pathology as etiology. Ignaz Semmelweis's demonstration of iatrogenic contagion as the cause of puerperal fever is a classic example. Lacking a demonstrable basis in somatic pathology, psychiatrists have long viewed mental illnesses as brain diseases whose nature remained to be elucidated. The discovery that general paralysis of the insane is a late sequela of syphilis exemplified and seemingly justified this premise. The continuing search for and current claims about the anatomic, infectious, genetic, and neurochemical bases of mental diseases reflect the same assumption. The somatopathological criterion of disease constrains people and politicians in ways they do not want to be constrained. If demonstrable bodily lesion is the sole criterion of disease, individuals who feel sick cannot define themselves as having a disease, nor can the state define certain behaviors as diseases. To be sure, drinking or smoking can cause disease, but the behavior itself is not a disease. For these and other reasons, people reject the discipline of a medical gold standard. Instead, they opt for fiat maladies, declaring that certain unwanted behaviors, stamped as medical diagnoses, are diseases. Adherence to this convention is supported by peer pressure and is enforced by the power of the medical profession and the state. So long as people accept fiat money, it is valued currency. However, when they reject it, for example, the German mark after World War I, it ceases to be real money. Similarly, so long as people accept fiat malady, it is a valid disease. However, when they reject it, for example, homosexuality in our time, it ceases to be a real disease. If mental illnesses are brain diseases, then they are diseases of the body, not of the mind. In which case, psychiatrists would have to conduct themselves like other physicians, that is, inform the patient of their findings and recommendations, and then wait until he consents to or rejects further diagnostic or therapeutic interventions. Such limitation of the psychiatrist's power would render psychiatry, as we know it, useless. This is why the well-being of the mental health professions and of the society they serve requires conflating and confusing disease and diagnosis, disease and disability, illness and incompetence, lesion and lawlessness, and much else besides. Dwelling on the bodily basis of mental diseases implies that medicine and psychiatry are fundamentally similar enterprises. Indeed, psychiatry is defined as a medical specialty. This is misleading. The history of modern medicine begins with Rudolf Virchow's definition of disease as somatic pathology, whereas the history of modern psychiatry begins with declaring certain persons insane and incarcerating them in madhouses. In short, the insanity defense and civil commitment came first, classifying certain patterns of misbehaviors as diseases to justify excusing and coercing the actors as medical interventions came later. Because the birth of modern psychiatry antedates Virchow by some 200 years, its principles and practices could not be based and are not based on the definition of disease as bodily lesion. Physicians detect, diagnose somatopathology, medical disease, for example, anemia, by examining bodies. Psychiatrists detect, diagnose psychopathology, mental disease, for example, schizophrenia, by examining persons. No mental illness can be detected by examining only the patient's body. As medical science and technology advance, diagnosing medical diseases becomes more accurate, treating medical illnesses more effective, and delivering medical goods and services more costly. Prior to the present century, consumers or their relatives paid for medical services, or if they could not afford to pay, received medical care as a charity or went without it. Today, in contrast, people and politicians alike regard relief from disease as an integral part of the state's obligation to its citizens. These circumstances, each reinforcing the other, render the struggle over the definition of disease and disability of the utmost practical, political, economic consequence. De-linked from the constraints of somatic pathology, defining misbehaviors as mental diseases and hence compensable disabilities becomes a tactic immensely useful not only for would-be patients, but also for relatives, employers, teachers, politicians, and nearly everyone else. As our society constructs and legitimizes more mental diseases, such as attention deficit disorder and false memory syndrome, more people are diagnosed as sick, and the escalating number of disabled Americans is then interpreted as proof of the prevalence of mental illnesses. Thomas, Syracuse, New York, September 1996. Preface to the original edition. Ideas Have Consequences. Richard Weaver. Before we can even begin to try to understand what causes a baffling and troubling phenomenon, or how we might change or remedy it, we must be sure of what it is. In other words, that we have correctly identified its indispensable features. John Selden, a 17th century English jurist and scholar, wisely warned that the reason of a thing is not to be inquired after till you are sure the thing itself be so. We commonly are at, what's the reason of it, before we are sure of the thing. No truer words could be spoken about psychiatry and its core concept, mental illness. What is, in Selden's words, the thing itself that psychiatrists describe, debate, diagnose, and treat? The psychiatrist says it is mental illness, which, he now quickly adds, is the name of neurochemical lesions of the brain. I say it is conflict and coercion and the rules that regulate the psychiatrist's powers and privileges and the patient's rights and responsibilities. The former perspective leads to an analysis of psychiatry in terms of illness and treatment, medical theory and therapeutic practice, while the latter perspective leads to an analysis in terms of coercion and contract, the exercise of power and the efforts to limit it. In short, political theory and legal practice. Accordingly, my aim in this book is to present a critical exposition of the idea of mental illness and its consequences. I do so first by situating it in relation to the closely related ideas of bodily illness, the patient role, and crime. Second, by exploring the connections among the ideas of mental illness, imitation, intention, and responsibility. And third, by articulating the practical uses of the idea of mental illness, especially as a rhetorical device for interpersonal control and social policy, and as an essential element in contemporary explanations of human behavior. Actually, anyone, even a person quite unfamiliar with psychiatry, could reason that a disease characterized as mental must be something other than a bodily disease. A moment's reflection about the way we use our language reveals the metaphoric nature of the mind. For example, we say that we have blood in our veins and ideas in our minds, but we know that the latter expression is only a figure of speech. Similarly, when an assailant shoots someone, the victim may suffer a gunshot wound of the brain, but not of the mind. In short, the term mind refers to an abstract idea and not to an actual object. Although this distinction between the concrete and the abstract, the objective and the fictional, is obvious to everyone when the body anatomic is contrasted with the body politic, it mystifies nearly everyone when an illness anatomic is contrasted with an illness politic, a term by which I mean any personal and social problem now called a mental disease. I want to add a few words here about what this book is not. It is not about the value of psychiatry in general or of any psychiatric intervention in particular. If we view mental illnesses and psychiatric interventions as socially constructed and culturally sanctioned ideas and institutions, similar to Christianity or communism, prohibition or the war on drugs, then it is superfluous to find value in them. Were such ideas and institutions devoid of values, they would not come into being and would not become important. I have discussed elsewhere the help or harm which depends on our values that may accrue to a person from mental hospitalization, neuroleptic drugs, psychoanalysis, and so forth. Here I want to concentrate on locating, clearly and precisely, the conceptual realm into which mental illness and the entire psychiatric enterprise belong, and the practical consequences to which they give rise. Once this is clear, evaluating the helpfulness or harmfulness of various psychiatric ideas and interventions is a relatively simple matter, that anyone with a modicum of intelligence and information can undertake for himself. The problem with psychiatry, it is sometimes said, especially by those critical of it, is that psychiatrists have too much power. True enough, but where does this power come from? It does not come from the barrel of a gun held by an oppressor. Instead, it comes from the beliefs of human beings who prefer to rely on mystifying symbols and paternalistic authorities rather than on themselves. Thus, only when people withdraw their blind faith in mental health and mental illness will they see fit to curb the powers of psychiatry, just as only when they withdrew their blind faith in God and the devil did they see fit to curb the powers of priestcraft. Finally, a brief caveat. In this book, I use the masculine pronoun to refer to both men and women, and the terms psychiatrist and patient to refer to all mental health professionals and their clients. I do so because I believe there are more effective ways of advancing the dignity and liberty of women, non-medical professionals, and psychiatric patients than by the now fashionable flaunting of linguistic deformations. Thomas S., Syracuse, New York, September 1986. Introduction. Men have an all but incurable propensity to try to prejudge all the great questions which interest them by stamping their prejudices upon their language. Sir James Fitzjames Stephen, 1873. Virtually all books on mental illness and psychiatry are about what goes on in the heads of either mental patients or psychiatrists. In the former class fall the tragedies written by former patients, novelists, philosophers, and some mental health professionals about what they, the sufferers, or those who sympathize with them, think is going on in the minds of the mentally ill. These are called the inner experiences of the insane and the torments inflicted on them by others. In the latter class fall the comedies written by psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and other professionals about what they, the scientists and therapists, eager to understand and help the helpless, think is going on in the minds of mental patients and what ought to be done about it. These are called the scientific theories and therapeutic techniques of psychiatry. Clearly, a person interested in mental illness and psychiatry needs to be familiar with both of these kinds of plays and the theaters in which they are performed. But for the real action, he must look elsewhere. What this book is about. The subjective experiences of the mental patient and the theories and therapies of the psychiatrist are like the covers of a book. The front cover, that first attracts our attention, is what the mental patient says and does. Next, we usually examine the back cover, namely what the psychiatrist says about the patient and does with him or to him. Often people go no further, satisfied that they can judge a book by its cover or covers. I believe something like this has happened with mental illness and psychiatry, especially during the past half-century, as more and more books have been written on this subject. The figures of the mental patient and the psychiatrist have become illuminated ever more brightly, casting the stage on which they perform, not to mention the activities going on backstage, in increasingly impenetrable darkness. Insanity, mental illness, or religious symbol. Thus, the scene I want to illuminate is not located inside the heads of the mental patient or the psychiatrist, but outside, in the real world, in the beliefs and behavior of ordinary men and women. Instead of viewing the mental patient and the psychiatrist as the stars of the show, as they invariably are viewed, I shall treat them as actors who merely play supporting roles. The star, indeed the superstar, is an idea called insanity or mental illness. I shall focus on the ways this idea shapes the behavior of family members toward one another, of politicians and legislators toward the citizen, of judge and lawyer toward the criminal, of journalist and writer toward his subject, and in the end, of every one of us toward everyone else. Like religious symbols in the age of faith, in the age of madness, psychiatric symbols are so richly meaningful that they cast their shadows on virtually every aspect of our lives. Accordingly, I have chosen to examine our principal psychiatric symbol, mental illness, from different angles, necessitating some repetition, but at the same time, permitting me to so organize the material that each chapter can almost stand by itself and can be read independently from the others. The character and complexity of the psychiatric enterprise and the relatively subordinate positions of the mental patient and the psychiatrist in it suggest another metaphor for it, namely music. The psychiatric ideology is like a musical score. The institutions of psychiatry, like symphony orchestras, the patients and psychiatrists, like the musical performers, judges and lawyers, like the conductors who direct them, politicians and psychiatric theorists, like the composers who provide the score for them, and intellectuals, opinion makers, and the general public, like enthusiastic audiences clamoring for more and better orchestral scores and symphonic performances. Of course, this in no way excuses psychiatrists from responsibility for the evil they do, just as it does not diminish the credit due them for the good they do. It does, however, put the male factions of the psychiatrist in context, and thus points the finger at those who share his guilt. Mental illness, fact or fiction. Although insanity is, without doubt, one of the most important modern ideas, the Dictionary of the History of Ideas has no entry for it or for any of its synonyms, such as madness, mental illness, psychiatric illness, or psychosis. This remarkable omission points to an important phenomenon, namely that insanity is now considered to be a fact, not an idea. By fact one means simply something like, say, cancer of the colon. That human beings have bowels is a fact. That bowels can become cancerous is also a fact. Today, everyone, including jurists and politicians, physicians and scientists, takes it for granted that just as bodily illness is an objectively definable and identifiable condition, so too is mental illness. As experts in mental health constantly remind us, mental illness is like any other illness. Moreover, the view that mental illness is not an idea, but an illness, a fact, is supported by the very existence of the governmental agency called the National Institute of Mental Health, an institution similar in name as well as ostensible purpose to the National Institutes of Arthritis, Cancer, and Neurological Diseases. Arthritis, cancer, and neurological diseases are, of course, illnesses, not ideas. The proposition that the term mental illness names a bona fide illness is also supported by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. The authors of the association's official Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-3, emphasize that, actually what are being classified in the manual are disorders that individuals have, emphasis added. In an obvious effort to underscore the factual material existence of mental illnesses, the authors add, the text of DSM-IL avoids the use of such phrases as a schizophrenic or an alcoholic, and instead uses the more accurate but admittedly more wordy an individual with schizophrenia, or an individual with alcohol dependence. By capitalizing the names of mental diseases, the APA evidently hopes to dispel any lingering doubt that these names refer to something other than real diseases. At the same time, it is obvious that in contemporary American speech and writing, the words illness and health, especially in their adjectival forms, have a dual reference to bodily disease or its absence on the one hand, and to good and bad behavior on the other hand. As a result, terms such as healthy and sane now do the job that words of praise did in the past, and terms such as sick and insane do the job that words of condemnation did in the past. What, writes a perplexed person to Ann Landers, can a woman do with a husband who refuses to live within his income? He brags to everyone that he is going to buy his daughter a car for graduation when our car isn't paid for yet. Ann Landers' reply, your husband is a compulsive buyer, which is a sickness. There is, let us make no mistake about it, nothing humorous or metaphorical in Miss Landers' diagnosis. She knows, and her readers know, that this man is mentally ill. If, then, nearly everyone believes or does not bother to doubt that mental illness is a fact, how does an author who regards mental illness as only an idea, albeit a very important one, describe and discuss it? Every use of the questionable term only reinforces the seeming reality of its existence. There are ways around this problem, of course, as the following familiar example illustrates. Consider these three different phrasings, any of which might have appeared in an American newspaper or magazine article after Pearl Harbor. 1. Because of the danger Japanese Americans pose. 2. Because of the alleged danger Japanese Americans pose. 3. Because of the danger so-called Japanese Americans pose. The first phrasing implies that the writer accepts the proposition that Japanese Americans pose a danger. The second questions that they pose a danger. The third questions both the reality of the danger and the legitimacy of classifying certain Americans as Japanese Americans. Because I question and reject many conventional psychiatric ideas and interventions, but want to use conventional language to communicate my ideas, there is a temptation to qualify certain commonly used words, such as mental illness, schizophrenia, mental hospital, mental patient, and so forth, by inserting alleged or so-called before them, or by putting the word between quotation marks. In order not to clutter the text with such disclaimers, I have resisted this temptation. The context, together with my general position on psychiatric matters, should make my meaning clear. An author who wants to describe and discuss something that nearly everyone accepts as a fact, but which he views merely as an idea, has some other problems to contend with as well. For example, how does he arouse and hold the interest of the general reader who knows that mental illness is an illness like any other? Or of the psychiatrist who has a vested interest, existentially as well as economically, in mental illness qua illness? The former has no need for a different perspective on mental illness, while the latter can ill afford one. Truth and the state. I feel content in the belief that, as Thomas Jefferson put it, it is error alone which needs the support of the government. Truth can stand by itself. Since, except for national defense, there is nothing that our government now supports more vigorously than health, especially mental health, anyone who values the truth ought to think twice before embracing the flood of information about mental illness that carries our government's imprimatur. I am convinced that psychiatric explanations and interventions are fatally flawed, and that deep in their hearts, most people think so too. The evidence for this abounds. If mental illness is common, can strike anyone, and is just like any other illness, as the experts claim, then why do people hardly ever think that they themselves have such an illness? Why are they not more afraid that they will get such an illness? And why, if they themselves are so wonderfully free of mental illness, do they find others so terribly full of it? In all these ways, mental illness resembles the scriptural beam in our own eyes and the mote in our brothers much more closely than it does diabetes or cancer. Mark Twain was right when he observed that nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits. While distressing behavior is real enough, and while it is possible to describe it more or less accurately, neither that reality nor its mapping has much to do with mental illness or psychiatry. Why this is so, I shall try to clarify in the pages that follow. Another problem I have had to resolve concerns presenting examples of mental illness or so-called case material. Since I do not believe in mental illness, I can present examples only of persons whom others have diagnosed as or called mentally ill. Accordingly, I cite many examples of mental illness and of acts committed by mental patients, culled for the most part from stories in magazines and newspapers. This not only allows both author and reader the same access to the same material, it also protects the reader from being gulled by distorted, contrived, or fabricated accounts of dramatic mental diseases and psychiatric cures. Part 1. Chapter 1. Defining illness. All illnesses, save those having emotional or functional causes, are expressions of cellular derangements. Stanley L. Robbins, M.D. The physician's task is to diagnose and treat disease. The vast literature of medicine catalogs the countless characteristics of diverse diseases and the various methods used for detecting and treating them. Despite the incredible outpouring of human labor devoted to this enterprise, and despite the fact that virtually all medical efforts, diagnostic and therapeutic, epidemiological and investigative, presuppose an understanding of and agreement about what constitutes disease, physicians and non-physicians alike often neglect to define disease, or worse, tacitly accept some temporarily fashionable definition. Because the concept of mental illness borrows from and leans on the concept of bodily illness, it is impossible to clarify the meaning of the former term without first coming to grips with the meaning of the latter. Accordingly, in this chapter I shall try to systematically articulate what we mean, and also what, if we want to be precise, we ought to mean when we speak about illness. It is often objected that scrutinizing the semantics of illness is a waste of time because it addresses only words and does not affect the reality of diseases. According to this view, widely held today, cancer is an illness and it exists regardless of what we call it. Similarly, schizophrenia is an illness, and it too exists regardless of what we call it. I shall let this objection, which embodies a dangerous fallacy, stand for the moment and refute it gradually as I go along. In his everyday work, the practicing physician diagnoses and treats many conditions that do not qualify as objectively identifiable or identified diseases. People who consult physicians complain of discomforts that may or may not be the manifestations of abnormal bodily processes. Moreover, if we consider the diseases diagnosed and treated by psychiatrists, who, and this is very important, are physicians, then the definition of disease as a structural or functional abnormality of the human body is obviously too narrow. Actually, physicians attend to a variety of problems. 1. Aches and pains, such as of the head or back. 2. Complaints about the body's behavior, such as insomnia or constipation. And 3. The behavior of the person who owns or inhabits his body, such as eating too much or too little, drinking too much, being pregnant without wanting to be, and so forth. Are these, shall we say, phenomena? The name is important because it is likely to prejudge our attitude. Also diseases? We shall see. Suffice it to say for now that, in an inquiry such as ours, answering this question prematurely would be a mistake. If we answer yes, we start down the perilous road of elasticizing the concept of disease so that it becomes monstrously large, as it in fact now is. If we answer no, we merely re-emphasize the familiar distinctions between bodily disease and mental disease, without helping us grapple with the ambiguities inherent in both the professional and lay definitions of disease. Hence, it is best to withhold judgment and use the question, are diseases diseases, as a philosophical and semantic bridge to higher ground from which to survey the pandemonium below. What is disease? The question, what is disease, may seem stupid because everyone now knows or thinks he knows the answer. Everyone can name a particular phenomenon that, he is quite sure, is a disease. For example, cancer, diabetes, AIDS. These are certainly diseases, but why? To this question, the answer is by no means obvious. Many people now say that these conditions are diseases because they disable and kill people. So do terrorism and war. Are they diseases too? I believe we must begin with a clarification of the idea of illness or disease. I use these two terms interchangeably, precisely because everyone knows what it is, if only through the notoriously fallible formula, I know it when I see it. To my mind, there is an alarming similarity between the present popular concept of disease and certain previous popular concepts, such as hell or witch. Everyone knew what they were too. Whenever masses of people, especially educated people, know something, and when what they know is something they greatly fear because they believe it affects virtually everything they do or want to do, then most likely we stand in the presence of a vast falsehood. Why do we construct definitions of concepts and categories? Why the periodic table of elements? Why the taxonomy of plants and animals? Why distinguish between killing and murder? Mutatis mutandis, why do we define disease? Why should we distinguish between being ill and being mentally ill? Classification is usually said to serve one or more of three interconnected aims. 1. To help us understand, order, and communicate information. 2. To establish jurisdiction or boundaries, for example, between human beings and animals, what is edible and not edible, what is therapeutic and noxious. And 3. To establish legitimacy and thus facilitate control of the environment, animate as well as inanimate. Only in the hardest of the hard sciences, and only where notation is basically mathematical, do definitions serve the first purpose exclusively. In other academic pursuits, the practical professions, and everyday discourse, definitions serve all three goals. It is precisely this multi-purpose character of our definitions and criteria of illness and mental illness that make a clear cataloging of the various meanings of the term illness imperative. We must, therefore, begin with an examination of the ways we use this term. Defining the class called disease. To begin with, The word disease is the name of a class. And what is a class? It is a group or set of persons, things, or qualities possessing common characteristics. Examples of classes of persons are males, females, children, doctors, Americans. Examples of classes of things are stones, trees, houses, cars, radios. Examples of classes of characteristics are pains, pleasures, discomforts, sufferings. What kind of class does the word disease refer to? Negative answers come more easily to mind than positive ones. Clearly, diseases are not persons. Are they then things? Well, some diseases seem to be things. For example, when a person has an unsightly blemish or growth on the surface of his body, say a basal cell carcinoma on his nose, the individual so affected may regard the lesion as a thing. He may ask his doctor, "Can't you take this thing off?" Medical students, too, are trained, at least initially, to view diseases as things. They dissect cadavers, which are things. Cadavers have diseased organs, cancerous livers, tuberculous lungs, which are also things. Although this is a good way to begin identifying what we mean by disease, it is only a beginning. For clearly, the class we conventionally call disease comprises many members that are not things, at least not in the sense that they are material objects like bodies or organs. What they are is something much more subtle, which perhaps is the source of a good deal of the confusion about this subject. Consider diseases such as diabetes or essential hypertension. These are not material objects that can be seen or touched or removed from the body, like a melanoma of the skin. Instead, they are the names of processes that, because of their consequences, we deem to be abnormal or pathological. Medical scientists now view virtually all diseases as pathological processes, with symptoms, signs, and visible and tangible lesions, such as an abscess, as their consequences. So far, we have identified the sorts of items that comprise the core concept of disease: abnormal bodies, organs, tissues, cells, and physiological processes. I shall call these items bodily diseases or real diseases or simply diseases. These, of course, are the diseases that non-psychiatric physicians diagnose and treat. As I have noted, some classes are composed of persons, others of things, and still others of qualities. What about the various states of personal discomfort, grief, or suffering that plague mankind? Are these diseases? Or are they diseases only if they are the symptoms of bodily abnormalities, as they sometimes are? Obviously, there is no merit in arguing about definitions, but there is a good deal of merit in being clear about them and honest about their consequences. Kenneth Minogue wisely warns that whatever taxonomy one may adopt, it cannot profitably be discussed except by taking some fairly decisive steps right at the beginning. Let us honestly identify these steps. Psychiatrists and all those steeped in the psychiatric ideology take the decisive initial step of omitting to define illness in general, or bodily illness in particular, and instead define mental illness, whatever they mean by it, as a member of the class called illness. I reject this approach. Instead of accepting the phenomena called mental illnesses as diseases, the decisive initial step I take is to define illness as the pathologist defines it, as a structural or functional abnormality of cells, tissues, organs, or bodies. If the phenomena called mental illnesses manifest themselves as such structural or functional abnormalities, then they are diseases. If they do not, they are not. Unless we exercise such candor, we shall stand in perpetual danger of confusing definition with discovery. What counts as illness? How do we know whether something is or is not an illness? Is alcoholism an illness? Or obesity? Or self-starvation? Is a pregnant woman who wants an abortion sick? Or a young man who commits a sensational crime ostensibly to impress a movie star? Questions such as these now crowd in on us from every side. Let us therefore continue our attempt to map the entire meaning of disease by making a list of the sorts of persons who are now viewed by professionals and lay people alike as having an illness. 1. Persons displaying overt or hidden signs of a bodily abnormality, for example, jaundice or persistently elevated blood pressure. 2. Persons complaining of being ill, for example, of persistent headache or progressive weight loss. 3. Persons complaining of a troubling condition or propensity, for example, homosexuality or agoraphobia. 4. Persons complaining of or said to be exhibiting insufficient self-control, for example, the alcoholic or compulsive gambler. 5. Persons committing shocking crimes, for example, killing their own children, parents, or spouses. I shall now briefly comment on each of these criteria. Criteria of illness. 1. Proven or demonstrated lesion. The criterion is a lesion that may be obvious to the naked eye, for example, bleeding or jaundice, or it may be demonstrable only with special instruments, for example, a blood count, X-rays, the electrocardiogram. This is the core concept of what constitutes disease. 2. Putative or suspected lesion. The criterion is still a lesion, but the lesion is postulated rather than proved. Typically, its presence is inferred from certain clinical evidence. As the disease progresses, it is expected to advance to a stage where the presence of a lesion can be proven. Before the advent of modern diagnostic technology, diseases such as neurosyphilis or myocardial infarction could not, in their early stages, be securely diagnosed or differentiated from complaints that merely mimicked their symptoms. The fallacy, popular today, that all conditions to which we now attach the name of an illness are putative diseases, which will, with the advance of science, turn out to be proven diseases, is based on this historical transformation of suspected diseases into proven diseases. 3. Suffering, causing suffering, and occupying the patient role. The criterion is not a lesion, but a complaint interpreted as having a bodily, medical reference. For example, according to authoritative medical opinion today, a pregnant woman who wants to be pregnant is not considered to be ill, whereas a pregnant woman who does not want to be pregnant is, and abortion is considered to be a treatment for her illness. The basic intellectual fact, writes a physician working in a Colorado abortion center, is that pregnancy is an illness for which there are various kinds of treatment. Similarly, a homosexual satisfied with his sexual orientation is not considered to be ill, but if he is dissatisfied with his sexual orientation, then he is considered to be ill, suffering from a disease called ego-dystonic homosexuality. Suffering may also be imputed to an uncomplaining person designated as a patient, for example, to an individual with so-called grandiose delusions, who is then said to be suffering from schizophrenia. Occupying the sick patient role by assuming it voluntarily or by being assigned to it involuntarily is the criterion that qualifies the occupant's alleged condition as a bona fide illness. Because suffering, whether self-avowed or imputed, is an especially important criterion of illness, I shall say more about it presently. 4. Bad habits, dangerousness to self. These criteria are unrelated to the body, except insofar as the body is involved in anything we do, from studying mathematics to playing baseball. Nevertheless, certain personally or socially disapproved behaviors, especially when they eventuate in bodily harm to the individual who engages in them, are now conventionally classified as diseases. For example, Soviet psychiatrists find that persons who cannot or do not control their displeasure with the political system of their own country suffer from creeping schizophrenia, while American psychiatrists find that persons who do not control their greed when in a casino suffer from pathological gambling. Similarly, an article in Science is tellingly titled, "Obesity Declared a Disease," while another, in the New York Times Magazine, explains that alcoholism is an illness. Alcoholism is generally defined as a disease in which the victim has lost control over drinking. Although he may want to, he is unable on his own to stop drinking. Anorexia, bulimia, drug abuse, smoking, and many other contemporary diseases fall into this category. 5. Criminality, dangerousness to others. The criterion used for diagnosing persons who commit certain sensational crimes as suffering from a bona fide illness, typically a mental illness, is similar to the criterion previously used. Instead of being dangerous to himself, the person is said to be dangerous to others. That the madman is dangerous is, of course, a time-honored idea. This fear is steadily reinforced by the fact that, as nearly everyone realizes, conscience and civilization form only a fragile shield against the violence that lurks in the human mind. Given this ever-present fear of the dangerous other, modern man welcomes the idea of insanity, of mental illness as a disease, as a supposedly scientific explanation of murder and mayhem. This is why, despite its nonsensical character, the view that only crazy people commit crazy crimes enjoys a large measure of intellectual respectability. See Chapter 8. Of course, The belief that crazy people who do crazy things suffer from a lesion of the central nervous system rests on nothing more than a leap of faith. That they suffer from a condition not so caused, but nevertheless properly called an illness, rests on a metaphorical use of the term illness. This particular extended use of the term illness is now amazingly popular in the United States. No longer is only the violent madman considered to be sick. Everyone who is violent is now viewed as sick. C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General of the United States, has declared, "Violence is every bit a public health issue for me and my successors in this century as smallpox, tuberculosis, and syphilis were for my predecessors in the last 2 centuries." Indeed, the United States Center for Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta, has a division called Violence Epidemiology Branch, which, according to a story in American Medical News, is giving priority to the issue murder, considering homicide to be a disease of epidemic proportions. Obviously, if we accept every one of the foregoing as a legitimate criterion of illness, we inflate the meaning of the word illness and its synonyms, such as disease and disorder, the latter being the latest psychiatric catchword. I shall not belabor this point. However, since psychiatrists often claim that experiencing suffering from almost any cause is itself sufficient warranty for regarding the subject as suffering from a disease, I want to offer some additional remarks on this subject. Suffering as a criterion of illness. As a personal experience and social problem, suffering is clearly not a purely medical concern. Indeed, in modern English, we use words derived from the ancient Greek term for suffering, pathos, to refer not only to certain phenomena conceptualized as diseases, but also to certain human experiences. For example, we use terms like pathetic or sympathetic to talk about matters unrelated to medicine or psychiatry, and terms like pathology and psychopathology to talk about bodily and mental diseases. Actually, only in earlier times, when efforts to heal spirit and body were united in an undifferentiated priestly medical enterprise, were physicians interested in suffering qua suffering. Today, physicians are interested in suffering only as a symptom pointing to an underlying disease. Traditionally, the problem of suffering has been the business of priests and religions. In the modern world, it has also become the business of politicians and the state. Revealingly, contemporary textbooks of medicine, surgery, pathology, or even therapeutics do not even mention suffering. References to suffering abound, however, in theological texts and in works about religion. For example, in Problems of Suffering in Religions of the World, John Bowker states that there are few better ways of coming to understand the religions of the world than by studying what response they make to the common experience of suffering. Regarding the role of suffering in Judaism, he writes, "Here is perhaps the supreme contribution of Israel to a human response to suffering, that suffering can be redemptive, that it can be the foundation of better things. In Christianity, the redemptive role of suffering is raised higher still. In Paul's experience, discipleship of Christ involves suffering. Thus, suffering is an important part of identification with Christ. Although redemptive suffering came initially from God or was self-inflicted, suffering inflicted on others also became redemptive in principle and hence justifiable in practice. In the 16th century, for example, there were 3 benefits which it was thought might justify the imposition of suffering on others: the unity of the state, the purity of the church, and the hoped-for repentance and salvation of those on whom suffering was inflicted. Clearly, this passage is pregnant with portentous implications for our own day, when the task of relieving and inflicting suffering belongs to the clinician rather than the clergyman. Moreover, since the clinician is increasingly an agent of the state, receiving not only his license to practice, but also his salary from the state, or from third parties under the control of public agencies, we now find ourselves confronted with an intimate alliance between medicine and the state. Institutional psychiatry, let us not forget, owes its origin and present importance wholly to the state, that is, to the fact that it is a service sought and paid for by persons other than the designated mental patient. Typically, the service is sought by the designated patient's relatives and is paid for by the taxpayer. With its progressive removal from the free market, medicine has assumed many of the economic and political features and problems that have long characterized psychiatry. This is why diagnosis and therapy are now increasingly politicized, and politics is increasingly medicalized. How has medicine, and especially psychiatry, become so entangled with the state, or more specifically with politics qua diagnosis and therapy? Briefly put, the answer to this question lies in the modern, liberal perspective on government, which instead of seeing the state as a threat to liberty, perceives it as a protection against poverty, disease, and other threats inherent in the vicissitudes of life. As Kenneth Minogue has elegantly described, the liberal identifies himself with the paternalistic state, wants to help, and therefore needs people who need help. Since no one needs help more than the person who suffers, the liberal, writes Minogue, adopts an intellectual device which interprets events in terms of what we may perhaps call suffering situations. Moreover, since for the liberal suffering situations justify the most far-reaching coercions imposed by agencies of the state, from taxing some to forcing unwanted help on others, he will feel strongly inclined to impute suffering, or at least a history of suffering, to any person or group he wants to help. The result is the theory of implied suffering, exemplified by the psychiatric perspective that purports to see suffering in the behavior of persons who smoke, drink, and gamble, all of which are now officially designated as mental diseases. Marching under the banner of this theory, the contemporary psychiatrist has occupied every nook and cranny of human behavior. Wherever he looks, he sees suffering requiring his ministrations. Some people are said to suffer because they say they do and because they seek help. Others are said to suffer, although they do not say they do, and may even deny suffering and refuse psychiatric or other help because they exhibit behavior psychiatrists call cries for help. It goes without saying that all such cries are directed toward psychiatrists, who are eager to respond, provided the state authorizes them to impose their help on unwilling clients and pays them to do so. Who defines disease? All too often, the problem of defining disease is debated as if it were a question of science, medicine, or logic. By doing so, we ignore the fact that definitions are made by persons, that different persons have different interests, and hence that differing definitions of disease may simply reflect the divergent interests and needs of the definers. Language is an instrument or tool. This is why, if an activity such as music or sports interests us, we have a rich vocabulary for it, and if it does not interest us, we have a poor vocabulary for it, or none at all. It is no accident that mama and dada are among the first words children learn. Similarly, as semanticists like to point out, because snow is very important for the Eskimo language has many different words for identifying a variety of snowy conditions. For us, snow is not so important, and we have only a few words for it. Disease, however, is important for us, and we have many words for it. The list of medical terms identifying different diseases, from alopecia to zoophobia, must run into the thousands, with the names of new diseases constantly being added. As we are a medically minded people who value the diagnosis and treatment of disease, this rich vocabulary is useful to us in much the same way that the rich vocabulary of snow is useful to the Eskimo. However, in our effort to understand illness in purely medical terms, we have stumbled into a great confusion. We have done so because of a stubborn refusal to see that although the idea of illness is rooted in a medical context, certain non-medical, for example, moral, economic, and political factors play a decisive role in imparting meaning to it. Every profession possesses a specialized language created by and for the particular professionals, serving their own purposes, and legitimized by the authority they enjoy. To see how the medical, psychiatric, and popular definitions of illness differ, let us first see how, for example, the chemical, economic, and popular definitions of, say, gold differ. If we asked, what is gold? The chemist might say, it is an element with certain chemical and physical characteristics whose atomic number is 79. The economist, that it is a precious metal traditionally used as a monetary medium worth so many dollars per ounce. And the man on the street, that it is the material out of which elegant and expensive jewelry is made, or perhaps that it is a protection against economic and political uncertainties. In short, For the chemist, gold is an element. For the economist, a medium of exchange. And for the man on the street, a thing of beauty or a source of security. For each, the term gold has a different meaning. The idea of illness can likewise be understood only if we are willing to entertain similar distinctions with reference to who uses it and for what purpose. For the pathologist, and for most physicians most of the time, illness is a disordered state or function of the body. If pressed, physicians might specify the anatomical or physiological characteristics of various disorders, such as myocardial infarction or hypertension. For the patient, illness is a feeling of discomfort or the experience of disability perceived as originating in the body. If pressed, patients might specify the experiential characteristics of various disorders, such as chill, fever, or pain. Thus, doctor and patient both tell us what disease is, each from his own perspective. We might say that physicians and medical organizations define and determine what constitute diseases and treatments, while patients and other non-medical persons define and determine which particular discomforts they consider to be troublesome enough to require medical attention and which treatments they regard as beneficial. Two types of illness, organic and psychological. Today, the standard medical criteria for determining what is a disease are of two kinds: deviations from biological norms and deviations from social norms. The former group comprises so-called bodily or physical diseases, such as cancer and heart disease. The latter, so-called mental or psychiatric diseases, such as depression and schizophrenia. The medical criteria for determining what constitutes treatment are likewise of two kinds: physiological or physicochemical, and psychological or sociocultural. The former group comprises the so-called organic methods of treatment, the latter the psychosocial methods. It must be kept in mind that each of these definitions rests on the authority of the person or group that makes them, that each varies with the interpretations and decisions of those who make them, that each serves the purposes of those who make them, and most importantly for our purposes, that mental illnesses are now defined as diseases. In this view, mental diseases are members of the class called illness. These definitions are useful partly as guides for helping the sick, and partly as guideposts to the definer's ideas and intentions. For example, although it had long been known that syphilis was a disease, during the early years of the First World War, British military physicians defined it as a crime, incurred as a result of deliberately careless or illicit sexual intercourse. On the other hand, although it had long been known that sometimes persons fake the manifestations of illness, and that such counterfeit diseases must be distinguished from real diseases, toward the end of the 19th century, physicians declared that these imitations were themselves illnesses. When X is not really X, if we keep our eyes and ears open, we encounter problems similar to the problem of what counts or does not count as illness wherever we turn. Claims advanced as if they were reasoned arguments and framed typically in the form X is not really X appear almost daily in the newspapers. In a single 2-day period, I came across 3 typical stories. The first, titled "Daughter Disowned After Marrying Gentile," is an Associated Press report about a young Jewish Canadian woman who married a non-Jewish man on August 23, 1984. A few days later, her parents placed their daughter's obituary in the Weekly Jewish Post newspaper, requesting that no condolences be sent or memorials made. According to Canadian civil authorities, this woman was very much alive. According to her parents and the Orthodox Jewish community to which they belong, she was quite dead. Is she really alive or dead? In the second story, the question is not whether a certain person is alive or not, but whether certain persons are Jews or not. On March 25, 1985, a combined United Press Associated Press release reported that Ethiopia has demanded the return of thousands of Ethiopian Jews transported to Israel in a secret airlift, saying they are not really Jewish and had been abducted, emphasis added. According to Israeli authorities, the starving Ethiopians airlifted to Israel are Jews. According to Ethiopian authorities, they are not Jews. Are these people really Jews or non-Jews? The third story, appearing in the same paper on the same day, is about a 63-year-old man who divorced his wife of 18 years in preparation for becoming a priest. The report cited Loyola University law professor James Forkins, an authority on family law and the Catholic Church, explaining that the man got divorced just to be sure, but in the eyes of the Church, he had never been married because he did not have a church wedding. Clearly, it would be pointless to ask whether this man was ever really married. Controversies of this type are not limited to religious and psychiatric authorities and their civil or legal counterparts. They are ubiquitous, and no individual or organization is immune to them. For example, the introduction of new legislation authorizing the execution of criminals sentenced to death by means of a lethal injection of drugs has prompted the American Pharmaceutical Association, whose members ought to know better, to declare that certain drugs are not really drugs. According to a report in American Medical News, the American Medical Association's official weekly newspaper, in order to help pharmacists who do not want to participate in executions, the American Pharmaceutical Association's House of Delegates decided that a drug used for lethal injection is not really a drug because it is not a medicine for the treatment, cure, or prevention of disease, emphasis added. Among the non-drugs used for such injections are potassium chloride, succinylcholine, decamethonium, sodium thiopental, and D-tubocurarine. Here is one more example to illustrate that no sooner do we define Class X by certain descriptive criteria than we decide, typically on purely strategic grounds, that some members of X are not really members of that class. See Chapter 9. In the United States today, some banks are called non-banks. The uncertain legal status of these institutions was settled in January 1986, when the Supreme Court ruled that non-banks can provide banking services. In a report titled, "Fed Loses Non-Bank Bank Case," the New York Times explained that non-bank banks function much like full-service banks, but limit their activities in order to skirt the statutory definition of banks and thereby avoid restrictions on interstate banking and other regulations. In short, whether a certain condition or conduct is viewed as disease, be it diabetes or depression, pellagra or pregnancy, may depend on whether the patient so defines it, whether the physician and the medical profession so define it, or whether the state so defines it. The same goes for treatment, be it penicillin or prayer, circumcision or conversation. However, in ordinary speech and practice, we designate all manner of conditions and interventions simply as illness and treatment, without bothering to identify who defines what and why. For example, at the beginning of this century, some women wanted contraceptive advice and asked other women for it. The voluntary participants in this transaction defined their goal as the preservation of the woman's health from unwanted pregnancies. The government defined it as a crime and prosecuted the dispensers of birth control information. Today, the government offers the same service, and some of those who now object to it call the measure genocide. Obviously, it is pointless to ask what birth control really is: a crime, a health measure, pregnancy prevention, or genocide. It is each of these from the point of view of certain persons or groups. It is possible, of course, to define illness as a condition identified by the patient, just as it is possible to define it as a condition identified by the physician. However, the former definition would mean that every individual who asserts that he is ill would have to be viewed and treated as ill, and every individual who asserts that he is not ill would have to be viewed and treated as not ill, a patently absurd proposition and program. But there is no need to go to such extremes. It is enough to acknowledge who defines what and controls whom. For example, in the typical case of bodily illness, say myocardial infarction, the subject identifies himself as suffering from an illness, and so does his physician. Whereas in the typical case of mental illness, say schizophrenia, the psychiatrist identifies the subject as ill, but the subject does not identify himself as ill. In the case of malingering, the subject identifies himself as ill, an identification the physician rejected in the past, but now accepts, qualifying the illness as mental. Let me run through this once more. I am suggesting that it is one thing to assay a piece of ore for its gold content, and quite another to dictate the value of the gold in it. Likewise, it is one thing to assay the nature of a physicochemical disorder of a human body, and quite another to dictate how its owner should conduct himself with respect to it. The first task requires knowledge or technical competence. Whether or not a person possesses knowledge or technical competence is a matter of fact or opinion. The second task requires power or control over persons. Whether or not it is legitimate to use power over people is a matter of ethics and politics. To appreciate the importance of these considerations requires making a clear distinction between an abnormal biological condition of the body called disease and the assumption of the social role of the sick person called patient, a subject one shall discuss in the next chapter. The regrettable fact that this distinction is now so confused, especially in the minds of physicians, is not my fault, but the fault of the medical profession. Chemists are satisfied with studying and trying to understand the chemical properties of gold and offering their services to clients who want them. But physicians are not satisfied with studying and trying to understand abnormal bodily processes and offering their services to clients who want them, but also insist on defining the patient role and determining the legitimacy of a host of health-related matters. This is a blunder for which all of us, doctors and patients alike, are paying a heavy price. To understand and perhaps undo this mistake, we must attend to and honestly acknowledge the diverse interests of the various moral agents, physician, patient, politician, judge, who may have the authority to define disease. Yet it seems to me that we ignore that. Especially in the United States, judges often determine what counts as a disease. For example, in 1985, the policy of a New Jersey high school requiring all students to submit to urine tests for illegal drug use was ruled unconstitutional on the ground that drug use is a medical illness like diabetes, cancer, or AIDS. Clearly, the term medical illness in this sentence does not refer to a scientific or medical concept. Judges are neither scientists nor doctors. Instead, they are experts on and arbiters of legal fictions, see Chapter 11. A judge cannot, does not, and is not expected to determine whether a particular piece of ore is radioactive or whether a particular skin lesion is a melanoma. What a judge can do, does do, and is expected to do is decide which legal fictions we must accept as social realities. If, then, judges determine, as they often do in the United States, but not necessarily in other countries, what is and what is not a disease, then we must realize that the term disease stands, among other things, for one of our important legal fictions. In addition, we must recognize that not only may different parties define disease differently, but that there is a crucial difference between having the authority to define disease and having the power to impose one's definition on someone else. For example, physicians on patients, patients on family members, judges on physicians or hospitals, legislators on everyone else. Finally, we must distinguish between possessing the expertise to deliver treatment and the means of doing so, from possessing the political power to impose treatment on those who do not want it, or to extract it from those who do not want to give it. These are simple distinctions. If we fail to make them, it is because we prefer to pursue hidden agendas of domination and submission concealed by a rhetoric of disease and treatment. The core concept of disease. As we have seen, the meaning of disease, as this term is commonly used, is so broad and vague that it defies definition. The result is twofold. One is that instead of clear criteria for counting, or not counting, something as a disease, we have endless exemplifications of it. The other is that the category called disease is perfectly elastic, accommodating virtually anything anyone wants to place in it, including metaphoric diseases, see Chapter 5. However, if we scrutinize what non-psychiatric medical researchers and specialists do, we see an ever more sophisticated search for and identification of anatomical and physiological lesions, such as those obtained by means of computerized axial tomography, CAT scan, and novel immunological techniques, and a similar search for and identification of the physicochemical causes of novel lesions, for example, the bacillus causing Legionnaire's disease or the virus causing AIDS. Thus, now more than ever before, the core concept of illness is bodily disease. If this were not so, why would psychiatric researchers be looking for the chemical lesions of schizophrenia and the pharmacological cures of mania? Not surprisingly, while medical researchers press forward in their search for bodily lesions, psychiatric researchers outdo each other in their efforts to obscure what constitutes disease. The following remarks by Samuel Goose, a professor of psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis, are pertinent in this connection. Most medical textbooks do not attempt to define disease, and most physicians never show much interest in the problem, suggesting either that the definition is unimportant or that they intuitively grasp its meaning and can therefore get on with more interesting questions. Because of these observations, it was proposed by Goose himself that any condition associated with discomfort, pain, disability, death, or an increased liability in these states, regarded by physicians and the public as properly the responsibility of the medical profession, may be considered a disease. This elastic definition of disease leads to the gradual incorporation of many personal and social problems into the concern of medicine, a trend Goose enthusiastically endorses. It is, of course, precisely this process of medicalization that underlies and supports psychiatry as a medical specialty, a subject discussed throughout this book. Suffice it to add here that the socially relativistic and morally uncritical nature of such a definition, which, incidentally, is not at all novel, invites the use of medical rhetoric and justifies resorts to coercive interventions to solve vexing social problems. Thus, about a century and a half ago, the idea of illness Goose now endorses was used to define black slaves who tried to run away to freedom as suffering from a disease called drapetomania, and to justify their torture as treatment. Authoritative definitions of disease, dictionaries, and textbooks of pathology. To identify the core meaning of disease, we must finally look to two types of authorities and sources. 1. Students of language and students of disease. 2. Dictionaries and textbooks of pathology. Let us see what they tell us. Most English dictionaries list disease as the first and most general meaning of the word disease. Once past this obstacle, they all define disease as a disorder of the material structure or function of a living body. For example, the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, defines disease as a condition of the body or some part or organ of the body in which its functions are disturbed or deranged. In a subsequent entry, there appears this significant addendum. Fig, a deranged, depraved, or morbid condition of mind or disposition of the affairs of the community, etc. In other words, the OED explicitly defines mental illness as a figurative or metaphoric illness. The revised first edition of Webster's New International Dictionary of the English Language, 1897, defines disease as follows: an alteration in the state of the body or of some of its organs, interrupting or disturbing the performance of the vital functions, and causing or threatening pain and weakness, malady, affection, illness, sickness, disorder, applied figuratively to the mind, to the moral character and habits, to institutions, the state, etc. Surely, there is no need to belabor this. The medical definition of disease is its literal meaning. Applying the term to the mind, moral character, habits, and so forth are its metaphorical meanings. The third, most recent edition of Webster's New International Dictionary, 1961, defines disease as an impairment of the normal state of the living animal or plant body or of any of its components that interrupts or modifies the performance of the vital functions. Sickness and illness are listed as synonyms. Interestingly, illness is defined as an unhealthy condition of body or mind. Stedman's Medical Dictionary defines disease as follows: morbus, illness, sickness, an interruption or perversion of function of any of the organs, an acquired morbid change in any tissue of an organism or throughout an organism. Even more remarkable are the definitions of disease offered by the physicians most specifically concerned with the material basis of disease, namely pathologists. For example, Stanley L. Robbins, professor of pathology at Boston University School of Medicine, whose pathologic basis of disease is one of the standard texts used in medical schools, begins his 1592-page work with these words: "The emerging physician is told so often, be concerned with the whole patient, that he sometimes forgets that behind every organic illness there are malfunctioning cells. Indeed, it is more correct to say that when a sufficient number of cells become sick, so does the patient. All illnesses, then, save those having emotional or functional causes, are expressions of cellular derangements," emphasis added. Note the pathologist's firm disavowal of mental illnesses as real, that is, cellular diseases. Interestingly, this passage appears only in the first edition, published in 1974. In the third edition, published in 1984, the claim that mental illness is an illness is rejected indirectly rather than explicitly. Pathology, we are told, is the medical discipline that deals with the study of deviations from normal structure, physiology, biochemistry, and cellular and molecular biology. Psychiatry is conspicuous by its absence from this list. If I have dwelled unduly on defining disease, it was for a good reason. Since the idea of mental illness borrows from, leans on, and cannot be analyzed independently from the popular and professional uses of the term illness, it would be foolish to dive into that subject, head first as it were, without making sure there is water in the pool. Faced with the idea of illness, modern man, despite, or perhaps because of, his desperate dependence on a sophisticated, highly technological medical system, is like a primitive person who has no concept of paternity. Such a person does not understand the role of the male in human procreation, and hence cannot understand what the term father means. How could one explain to him the differences between two kinds of fathers, that is, between men so-called because they have begot children, and men so-called because they have become priests? Since such a person does not know what literal fathers are, he cannot know what metaphorical fathers are. Similarly, so long as we do not know, or do not want to know, what literal illnesses are, because we refuse to define disease in an operationally meaningful way, we cannot know what metaphorical illnesses are. See Chapter 5. Hence, if we want to understand the idea of mental illness, we must first establish and agree on what belongs and what does not belong in the class called bodily illness and why. Chapter 2. Being a Patient. Anglo-American law starts with the premise of thoroughgoing self-determination. It follows that each man is considered to be the master of his own body, and he may, if he be of sound mind, expressly prohibit the performance of life-saving surgery. Nathanson Klein, I-960. The term illness, as we saw, refers to a condition of the body or its constituent parts. The term patient, on the other hand, refers to a social role occupied by a person, specifically the person who defines himself as ill, or more strictly, who stands in some socially recognized relationship to a medical professional or institution. The patient role. The concept of role, borrowed from the stage, plays a pivotal part in modern sociological, psychological, and psychiatric theories of behavior. Furthermore, even in everyday life, removed from theorizing about the workings of human personality, the concept of social role plays a very large and obvious part. We often identify ourselves and others in terms of our respective roles, for example, as sons, fathers, husbands, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. Roles are readily classified according to the social context or situation to which they belong, for example, familial, occupational, political, religious, and so forth. In the medical context, we recognize roles such as doctor, nurse, and patient, and their refinements, such as anesthesiologist, operating room nurse, and mental patient. Among the most important characteristics or functions of a social role are the following. 1. It identifies a comprehensive pattern of attitudes, behavior, and expectations. 2. It is publicly, often formally, identified as an entity. 3. It can be played by different individuals. 4. It is the principal criterion for identifying and situating persons in society. And 5. It often constitutes a strategy for coping with a recurrent type of situation or problem. Terms such as doctor, psychiatrist, patient, and mental patient all refer to roles in the sense used above. The fact that a role is a socially identified and recognized ensemble or entity, together with the fact that it can be played by different individuals more or less the same way, generates an important problem in everyday life. A problem especially acute in medical practice, and most acute in psychiatry. The problem is that the uniformity of certain patterns, which we call a role, is only one side of the coin. Its other side is that a role hides and indeed obliterates the unique individuality of its occupant, who becomes, in the language of the law, fungible or exchangeable. We cannot have it both ways. As persons, we are considered to be unique individuals. As the occupants of roles, we are supposed to be like other occupants of the same role. Consider the following example. A man says to his family doctor, "My wife needs a psychiatrist." The statement implies that he would accept anyone his doctor recommends as a psychiatrist for his wife. By contrast, suppose he were to say, "I would not let anyone but Dr. Jones operate on me." This means that he wants one particular person as his surgeon. The fact is that the same or similar treatment of different persons suffering from the same disease is now considered to be the hallmark of rational medicine, so-called individualized treatment, smacking of being old-fashioned and unscientific. Here again, we face the fact that we cannot have everything in life. As patients, we cannot have both the personal care of the old-fashioned general practitioner and the scientific competence and technical skill of the modern super-specialist. As physicians, we cannot simultaneously play the roles of healer, compassionately caring for sick persons, and of technician, scientifically treating diseases. Becoming a patient. Medical and allied texts, as I have remarked earlier, deal with diseases and treatments. They do not deal with how physicians come into the presence of diseases, with what authorizes them to make pronouncements about sick persons, or with whether they may or may not intervene in these persons' lives. This situation reflects the fact that most people understand how a person becomes a physician. They are familiar with the education and certification a person must acquire to transform himself from a layman into a socially acknowledged, licensed, practicing physician. People thus understand that being a doctor and being a healer are two separate things, that some doctors are healers, but others, for example, forensic pathologists, are not, and that some healers are doctors, but others, for example, unorthodox practitioners or quacks, are not. However, most people have no comparable understanding of how a person becomes a patient. They do not know, and often do not care to know, what a person must do or undergo to transform himself and be transformed by others from a non-patient into a socially acknowledged, certified patient. This is why people do not understand that being ill and being a patient are two separate things, that some patients are ill, but others, for example, healthy persons who go to physicians for routine checkups, or because they are afraid they are ill, are not, and that while some non-patients are healthy, others, for example, sick Christian Scientists who avoid physicians, are ill. Let me pause here for a moment and reconsider what we mean when we use the term patient. According to Webster's, a patient is a person under treatment or care, as by a physician or surgeon, or in a hospital. Of course, the concept of patient, like the concept of illness, may be defined by anyone. A person may feel unwell and consider himself to be a patient. His family may treat him as a patient. A physician may accept him as his patient, or a hospital may admit him as a patient. I use the term patient, unless otherwise qualified, as meaning a social role legitimized by appropriate medical and legal authorities. Understanding the transformations of persons into patients is crucial for our proper grasp of medicine and allied fields as practical endeavors. For only in theory do physicians deal with diseases. In practice, they deal with persons who may or may not be ill and who may or may not be patients. To put it differently, the practicing physician deals with diseases only through patients. Sick persons are, as it were, the carriers of diseases, or more specifically, of diseased bodies or body parts. We must therefore now ask, who owns a person's or patient's illness? The patient himself, his family, his physician, or the state? Similarly, if we view treatments not abstractly as chemotherapy or psychotherapy, but concretely as interventions performed by physicians on the bodies or minds of patients, we must ask, who owns medical or psychiatric treatment? The physician himself, his patient's family, or the state? Although these questions are about diseases and treatments, they are not medical questions. They are economic, moral, legal, and political questions. The anatomy of the medical situation. Language not only mirrors experience, but also shapes it. It not only reflects experience, but also refracts it. Language can thus both stimulate and inhibit experience. In contrast to our rich vocabulary for illness, it is the more remarkable how poor our vocabulary is with respect to identifying various kinds of doctor-patient relationships. This semantic impoverishment clearly is not a manifestation of our disinterest in this matter. Instead, our inability to name, simply and correctly, different dimensions of our experiences of being ill and seeking medical care reflects the mystification of aspects of our lives that are intensely important, but are, at the same time, also intensely embarrassing and frightening. The result is that we can describe certain conditions and interventions only with cumbrous circumlocutions and are often unable to identify them accurately. For example, we speak of persons as ill regardless of whether they are ill in body or mind, whether they consider themselves sick or are only so considered by others, whether they undergo treatment voluntarily or involuntarily. Thus, we are faced with a remarkable paradox. On the one hand, our culture displays a high degree of sophistication, both medical and lay, with respect to the diagnosis and treatment of the major bodily diseases. On the other hand, it displays an almost total lack of sophistication, both medical and lay, with respect to the rights and obligations of patients and doctors vis-à-vis themselves, each other, and the state. To remedy this situation, we need not more research, but more courage. The information we need to comprehend the ramifications of the doctor-patient relationship is at hand. What is missing is the willingness to clearly articulate that information by using words honestly and supporting their true meaning legally. Who owns the body? The view that the body is a biological machine, at once explicit and implicit in the practice of modern medicine, requires a decision about who controls, or, so to speak, owns the body. Having to make such a decision presupposes a departure from our Judeo-Christian heritage. Inasmuch as in that religious perspective, God is believed to have created and thus own everything, including our bodies and souls, the question of who owns the body is already answered, and hence cannot arise. It is this religiously inspired understanding of our proper relations to our own bodies, note the verb as adjective, that accounts for traditional prohibitions not only against suicide, but also against eating certain foods, engaging in certain sexual acts, and during a long period of Christianity, even against certain medical treatments other than prayer or other church-approved methods. After the decline of religion during the Enlightenment, the state assumed many of the powers formerly enjoyed by the church, including certain powers over the bodies of persons as well as over persons themselves. The upshot is that different political systems impose different limits on self-ownership, theological and totalitarian systems allowing less and free societies more room for individual self-determination in matters of health. It is indeed impossible to grasp the historical origin and cultural significance of the idea of insanity without situating it clearly in the context of the medical situation of modernizing free societies. In this context, the role of patient specifically, the right of a competent adult to seek or reject care is quintessentially voluntary, and so is the role of physician specifically, his right to accept or reject a person as his patient. Clearly, in the social context of a market-oriented society, the medical situation is readily assimilated to the model of a voluntary transaction between buyer and seller, patient and physician. Since the voluntary exchange of goods or services for money is the normal mode of human relatedness in the marketplace, the doctor-patient relationship poses no problems so long as it is mutually consensual. While in a moment I shall suggest that we view the human body as if it were like an automobile, asserting that a person owns his body much as he owns his car would be oversimplifying the situation. Suffice it to emphasize here that in a free society such as the United States, a sane adult has a virtually unlimited right to reject medical interventions, whether diagnostic or therapeutic. I shall refrain from digressing into a discussion of the vast literature on this subject, and will limit myself to citing 3 authoritative comments illustrating the American legal posture toward the right to reject medical interventions. The first is the classic case of In re Estate of Brooks, in which the courts upheld, even in an emergency situation, the patient's refusal of treatment. The second is former Chief Justice, then Circuit Judge, Warren Burger's frequently cited opinion concerning the constitutionality of allowing Jehovah's Witnesses to reject blood transfusion, even when the transfusion may be life-saving. Recalling Justice Louis Brandeis' words about our right to be let alone, Justice Berger added these decisive words. Nothing in this utterance suggests that Justice Brandeis thought an individual possessed these rights only as to sensible beliefs, valid thoughts, reasonable emotions, or well-founded sensations. I suggest he intended to include a great many foolish, unreasonable, and even absurd ideas which do not conform, such as refusing medical treatment even at great risk, emphasis in the original. Finally, Robert M. Brin, a legal scholar, offers this summary of the situation. Every competent adult is free to reject life-saving medical treatment. This freedom is grounded, depending upon the patient's claim, either on the right to determine what shall be done with one's body, or the right of free religious exercise, both fundamental rights in the American scheme of personal liberty. Although Justice Berger bravely defends our right to hold foolish, unreasonable, and even absurd ideas, Brin correctly emphasizes that the right to reject medical treatment is contingent on the agent's competence or sanity, a caveat that again underscores the pivotal role insanity plays in all of medicine, not just in psychiatry. The doctor-patient relationship. As we have seen, the core of the modern concept of illness rests squarely on the view that the body is a biological machine. The body is made in a certain way. It works in a certain way. It requires certain raw materials for its maintenance and proper functioning. It exhibits certain weaknesses and ways of reacting to injury. And finally, it decays and eventually ceases to function. Meshing with this materialistic, biological idea of illness is the view of the physician as a mechanic diagnosing and fixing the human body, and of the hospital as a garage where such repairs are carried out. This model offers a useful, albeit incomplete, account of the way modern physicians practice their craft. The account is incomplete because while doctors often think, and sometimes like to believe, that they practice their craft on human bodies, in fact, that is obviously not what they do. Actually, they practice their craft on bodies that are aspects or parts of human beings or persons. Hence, we must attend to how persons relate to bodies, their own and others, and to how physicians relate to the bodies and personalities, minds, of persons called patients. Let us, then, in the next few pages, treat the human body as if it were like an automobile. Automobiles belong to their owners. If a person chooses not to put oil in the crankcase and burns up the engine, that is his business. If he chooses to overload the car and cracks the frame, that is his business. And whether he chooses to take his car to a garage for a mechanic to fix is also his business. Furthermore, as the owners of automobiles are free to seek or avoid mechanics, so the adult members of free societies are, as a rule, free to seek or avoid physicians. Also, as a rule, people know equally little about the structure and function of their cars and of their bodies. Only rarely does a person take his car to a mechanic with a clear idea of what is wrong with it or how it should be fixed. Of course, sometimes a person does know, as when a tire goes flat. That is an obvious lesion with equally obvious remedies, repairing the tire or purchasing a new one. More often, however, a person takes his car to a mechanic with no such obvious lesion, but rather with obscure complaints. For example, the car stalls in traffic or does not accelerate properly. The mechanic examines the sick car, makes a diagnosis, and prescribes the treatment, a tune-up and new spark plugs. In other words, the owner of the automobile presents the mechanic with his car's symptoms. The mechanic examines the car, diagnoses its disease, and treats the lesions responsible for it. The medical parallel is obvious enough. When a person breaks an ankle skiing, the lesion is evident to both patient and doctor, but when he experiences increasing fatigue and weight loss, the lesion, if any, is likely to be far from obvious, and competent diagnostic studies will be needed to discover it. The important similarity between these two situations is that in each case, the relevant differences between the two parties pertain to two distinct issues, namely, their differing expertise about recognizing and repairing defects or diseases, and their differing legal authority over the problematic object. Typically, the owner of a malfunctioning automobile knows much less than his mechanic about the defects of automobiles and how to repair them, but the car belongs to him, not to the mechanic. Similarly, the patient usually knows much less than his doctor about diseases and treatments, but he, not the physician, has legal control over his body. Once a defect is discovered, these differences often become relatively unimportant. Both parties are now likely to agree that a lesion exists and should be repaired in a mutually agreeable manner. I schematize this situation in Table 2.1, Row 1. Doctor and patient agree about the nature of the illness and the proper remedy for it. Obviously, there is not always such an agreement between clients and experts. The parties may disagree about the existence or nature of the lesion, as well as about the reparative tactic appropriate or necessary for its relief. For example, although a car may have a poorly tuned engine, its owner might choose because he is negligent or has no money to continue driving it in its defective condition. Table 2.1, Being 3 and Being a Patient, Conventional Perceptions of the Person's Situation. Patient-physician relationship, if any. Social role, not being a patient. Bodily condition, no illness. 1. The sick person seeks medical help, assumes the patient role, the standard model of the good, sick patient. 2. The sick person does not seek medical help, does not assume patient role, the standard model of the sick non-patient, denial of illness, the sick Christian Scientist rejecting medical help. 3. The well person seeks medical help, assumes patient role, the standard model of the bad, non-sick patient, the malingerer, the neurotic. 4. The well person does not seek medical help, the standard model of the healthy person. The corresponding medical situation, comprising all the encounters in which demonstrably ill persons reject the patient role, is, as I have emphasized already, very important. A person may be ill with or without obvious symptoms or signs of illness, and yet choose, for many reasons, not to seek or receive medical attention. Whether or not a person is allowed to do so is a legal and political question. Sick prisoners often can, sick children sometimes, sick psychotics almost never. The important point again is that in free societies, sick adults, neither imprisoned nor declared insane, have a virtually unqualified right to avoid or reject medical care. Such persons are, of course, ill and may properly be said to have a disease, but they cannot, properly speaking, be said to be patients. This situation is represented in Table 2.1, Row 2. The person is ill but is not a patient. The opposite situation is equally important for medicine as well as psychiatry. The car is okay, but its owner claims it is not and wants it repaired. A healthy person claims to be sick and wants to be a patient. Although for obvious reasons, this situation occurs less often with respect to cars than bodies, it is not something I have contrived or imagined. Just as many people are now more interested in keeping their bodies fit than in doing something interesting or useful with them, so many people are more interested in keeping their cars in perfect shape than in using them. Let us assume that such a person hears his car squeak or rattle noises no one else can hear and takes it to his mechanic to have it checked and fixed. We know what will happen. Depending on circumstances, the automobile hypochondriac may be told that there is nothing wrong with his car or that it has some defect, which will be appropriately named, and needs fixing. In the latter case, having been provided with an automotive diagnosis and the semblance of fixing the trouble, the car owner will be satisfied and the mechanic will have made some money. When this situation occurs in medicine, its consequences are momentous, not just for the patient and his body, but also for medicine as an institution, for psychiatry, and for all of society. Here is the scenario. A person believing that he is sick goes to a doctor or clinic, or perhaps a succession of doctors and clinics. The doctors examine him and find nothing wrong with his body. What happens next? The doctor might tell the patient that he can find nothing to account for his symptoms, in short, that he is healthy. In the present cultural and medical climate of opinion, this is not likely to happen. Moreover, should it happen, it is unlikely to change the patient's conviction that he is ill. It is more probable that the doctor, though convinced that his patient is healthy, conjures up an impressive-sounding diagnosis, tells the patient that is what ails him, and prescribes treatment with a placebo, mild tranquilizer, or worse. There is a long list of such contrived medical diagnoses and treatments, their popularity subject to changes in fashion. In any case, the diagnosis secures for the patient the proof he is seeking and legitimizes him in the patient role with its myriad personal, social, and economic consequences. It also permits the physician to practice his craft vis-a-vis a much larger clientele than he could were he to identify such persons as healthy and hence not requiring medical services. Perhaps the reader is growing impatient, saying to himself something like this: obviously, these people are mentally ill. They are hysterics and hypochondriacs who believe they are ill, and that is their illness. Precisely. This is the crucial step, the decisive leap of faith, the shift in definition, the fatal professional compromise that physicians took about 100 years ago. They have clung to it and have tried to consolidate its catastrophic consequences ever since. Ostensibly, the modern scientific physician's professional mandate is to discover and treat bodily diseases. When he discovers evidence of disease, he says so. For example, the pathologist declares that a histological specimen of breast tissue shows evidence of malignancy. When he discovers no evidence of disease, he also says so. However, this rule is followed strictly only in relation to laboratory specimens and objective measurements, such as blood tests, Rowan genograms, and so forth. Confronted with persons whom doctors consider to be sick, not because they have demonstrable lesions, but because they are called patients, the rule doctors follow, indeed are expected to follow, is quite different. It is that such persons must under no circumstances be declared to be, or called, healthy. Faced with a healthy patient, the doctor must make a legitimate-sounding diagnosis. In other words, he must contrive or invent a non-existent disease. During the past century or so, doctors have invented two different kinds of such non-existent diseases: bodily and mental. Examples of the former are mythical disorders of the uterus and ovaries, especially popular in the United States, and mythical ailments of the liver, especially popular in France. Examples of the latter are all of the mental diseases, especially neurasthenia in the past, and the various anxiety and stress disorders today. Finally, both doctor and patient are encouraged to and may attribute mental, psychological disease to bodily, somatic causes and vice versa, the patient convincing himself that he has a real disease and the doctor that he is treating a real disease. Let me offer a few more remarks on why patients and doctors behave this way. As scientific advances in medical diagnosis accelerated during the second half of the 19th century, the physician confronted by a person complaining of undiagnosable ills faced a very serious dilemma. What should he tell such a person? And what should he tell himself? The most obvious option open to a physician in this situation is to tell both the patient and himself the truth, namely, that with the methods and knowledge presently available to him, he cannot find anything wrong with the patient's body. Such a stance, however, frustrates both patient and doctor. The former, because he wants to be legitimized in the patient role, the latter, because he wants to find disease so that he can prescribe treatment. This is why physicians rarely chose telling the truth in the past, and why, as the medical profession and the public have redefined the rules of the medical game, doing so has ceased to be an option altogether. The redefinition to which one refer consists of the physician following a new rule. Regardless of whether or not he can discover a somatic lesion to account for a patient's complaints, he must view the claimant as a bona fide patient and must declare him to be ill. Thus did doctors simultaneously invent symmetrical pairs of mental, fictitious diseases and mental, fictitious treatments for them. For example, all species of maladies and magnetization, Anton Mesmer. Neurasthenia and medically imposed rest, S. Weir Mitchell. Grand hysteria and hypnosis, Jean-Martin Charcot. General neuroses and faradization, Wilhelm Erb. Conversion hysteria and catharsis, Joseph Breuer. Actual and transference neurosis and psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, and so forth. Clearly, if disease means bodily disease, then mental diseases are metaphoric diseases, just as priests are metaphoric fathers. But this is precisely what is denied by all contemporary authorities and institutions that define the terms by which we must play the medical game. They unanimously declare that mental diseases are bona fide diseases, that metaphoric diseases are literal diseases. Conceptually, psychiatry, except insofar as it addresses bona fide brain diseases, thus rests on a literalized metaphor, Table 2.1, Row 3. To complete this survey of the combinations generated by the fact that the abnormal biological condition of a human being called illness and the assumption of the sick role called being a patient vary independently, we must briefly note the fourth and last situation. The person has a healthy body and does not seek medical attention. Table 2.1, row 4. This is what we ordinarily mean by a healthy person. Table 2.1 displays, in condensed form, the four combinations that result from identifying the patient-physician encounter in terms of two variables: physicochemical abnormality of bodily structure or function, or literal illness, and assumption of the sick role, or being a patient. The information in this table rests on and embodies several assumptions or definitions, namely, that a disease is a physicochemical abnormality of the human body, that the presence or absence of disease is determined by the physician, that the role of patient is voluntarily assumed or avoided by the subject, and that the state, in its role as the political authority of society, does not interfere with the physician's judgment about illness or the individual's decision about assuming or rejecting the role of patient. This table highlights the fact that being ill and being a patient go together like love and marriage. That is, rarely. Yet most people now assume that persons who are ill are patients, and that persons called patients have diseases. Actually, most persons who have diseases are not patients because they do not believe they are ill, are poor, or have no access to medical care. And most patients have no diseases because communicating personal problems through complaints about the body is the universal language of mankind. Condition and role, a restatement. It is impossible to understand the problems mental illness poses for Americans, individually as potential mental patients and collectively as a society expected to cope with such patients, without a firm grasp of the differences between literal and metaphorical diseases and between biological conditions and social roles. I have described the core meaning of the idea of illness in the previous chapter and will devote a subsequent chapter to the analysis of mental illness as metaphoric disease. I now want to restate the basic distinction between being sick and being a patient in somewhat different terms. Today, most educated persons understand the differences between a person having been killed and having been murdered, between a person being a killer and being a murderer. But few people now understand the differences between having a disease and being a patient, between being sick and being in the sick role. Actually, killing and murder stand in the same sort of relation to each other as do having a disease and being a patient. The extent to which this analogy falls flat is a measure of the injury which modern medical thinking has inflicted on our understanding of human rights and responsibilities. Killing and sickness are facts. Being officially categorized as a murderer or patient are ascriptions or roles. Thus, a person may be killed, for example, by lightning without having been murdered, and a person may be considered to be a murderer, for example, an innocent person convicted of murder without having killed anyone. Similarly, a person may be sick, for example, suffering from hypertension without knowing it, and not be a patient, and a person may be considered to be a patient, for example, by faking illness to avoid the draft or obtain damages for alleged injuries without being ill. Yet the modern, scientifically enlightened person instinctively rejects the disjunction between illness and the sick role, and insists that everyone who is sick is ipso facto a patient, and that everyone who is called a patient is sick. This posture, generally regarded as both compassionate and scientific, is manifested by the intense intolerance shown toward persons believed to be physically ill who reject the patient role, and, to some extent, also toward those who play the patient role even though they are believed to be not physically ill. Individuals falling into the latter group used to be regarded as malingerers, a concept emblematic of the understanding that a healthy person can play the role of a sick person. Now malingerers are regarded as suffering from factitious illnesses, a concept emblematic of the rejection of the very possibility of a disjunction between illness and the sick role. For further discussion, see Chapter 5. Why does a person become a patient? Since, for the most part, people do not like being sick, one might be tempted to say that they are forced into the patient role. In a sense, that is often true, but it is important that we distinguish between the two radically different senses in which persons are forced into the roles of patient and mental patient. Choice and the patient role. Ordinarily, people avoid doctors and the patient role. It is when a person experiences pain or some other bodily discomfort that the fear of illness and the hope of relief from pain and disease force him, as it were, to seek out medical services. The person visits his physician or goes to a hospital emergency room. Actually, such a person chooses to enter the role of medical patient, a choice often concealed by the fact that the patient may feel that, in his condition, he has no choice but to seek medical help. However, the phrase "no choice" is here a figure of speech. The person has a choice legally, psychologically, and practically, but it is a choice in which the desire to seek the patient role may far outweigh the desire to avoid it. People also avoid psychiatrists and the role of mental patient. I disregard, for the moment, the truly voluntary mental patient, who seeks psychiatric help much as the medical patient seeks medical help. Since for the most part people do not like being mental patients, one might be tempted to say that they too are forced into that role. Indeed, that is true. However, persons are forced into this role literally by other people. Typically, the mental patient does not choose to enter the role he is in, a lack of choice readily concealed by the fact that, confronted with the overwhelming powers aligned against him, he may elect to seek psychiatric care. In other words, the patient with bodily illness, experiencing suffering, is driven to go to a hospital by pain, whereas the patient with mental illness, making others suffer, is driven to a mental hospital by the police. The similarities and differences between bodily illness and mental illness are like the similarities and differences between the ways the word driven is used in these two sentences. This is why I insist that the term voluntary mental patient is problematic. The would-be mental patient may have no choice but to accept the role, for if he does not become a mental patient voluntarily, he could, through commitment, be compelled to become one involuntarily. I shall say more about this later. Medicine and the state, from treating patients to treating diseases. Our vocabulary for describing the medical situation is not only impoverished, it is also one-sided. We are accustomed to defining the sphere of medical action in terms of the organ system or type of patient the doctor treats. For example, we identify doctors as dermatologists, cardiologists, nephrologists, neurologists, or as pediatricians or geriatricians. These distinctions do not help lay people to recognize who controls the medical transaction or how it is controlled. Yet, as medicine is increasingly politicized, both doctors and patients are increasingly imperiled if they overlook the elements of power and control in their relationship to each other and to third parties, especially the state. In the 19th century, the elements of power and control in the medical situation were less problematic, if only because they were more overt. Privately practicing physicians caring for private patients were the agents of the patient. Psychiatrists were the agents of the state. And physicians working in charity hospitals caring for the poor were primarily the agents of medical education and medical science, rendering the patient care only insofar as it did not conflict with that mandate. Today, the situation, especially in the United States, is radically different. Everyone now expects the practicing physician to be the patient's agent, and everyone pretends that he is the patient's agent, although the patient rarely pays the physician directly for his services. The result is the economic, ethical, legal, and political disorder that characterizes the present medical scene. It is not within the scope of this study to address this conundrum. However, I want to offer a few remarks on what is now happening in American medicine, because certain current developments in the so-called delivery of health services illuminate the problems of psychiatry and vice versa. The distinction between having an illness and being a patient, or more specifically, between treating an illness and treating a patient, which has always bedeviled psychiatry, is now coming to plague medicine as well. However obvious this distinction might be, it has not prevented the most influential men and women concerned with health policy in the United States from constructing a scheme for reimbursing hospitals based on the fictitious principle that doctors treat diseases, not patients. The monster called psychiatry is a monument to what happens when physicians are entrusted with treating diseases regardless of what the patients desire, consent to, or are willing to pay for. In collaboration with American politicians, American physicians have now created a similar monster and have called it the DRGs, diagnosis-related groups. While at the moment this system of reimbursing hospitals applies only to patients covered by Medicare or Medicaid, physicians and hospital administrators expect and fear that, in an effort to control costs, other third-party payers, in particular insurance companies, such as Blue Cross Blue Shield, will adopt a similar policy. Although the ostensible aim of the DRG system is to control costs, only an idiot would accept that rationalization. Its real aim is to further bureaucratize and mechanicalize the system, and depersonalize and depower both the patient and the physician. In short, the DRGs at once symbolize and sanction a system of medical care in which physicians treat and are expected to treat, or even must treat, diseases. They do not treat and cannot treat patients, clients, customers. See Chapter 4. Perhaps this is a case of divine retribution. During recent decades, physicians refused to resist the temptation of feeding at the public trough, unhesitatingly betraying their patients and themselves by offers of largesse from the state. To make more money, all the physician had to do was shift the cost from the patient to the state, taxpayer, and the dollars poured in. Now the politicians and medical bureaucrats who hold the money bag are tightening the strings. How do they do it? By taking seriously what they have learned. Clearly, doctors have stopped treating patients and have switched instead to treating diseases. But, unlike patients, diseases are similar to one another. Like cans of tuna fish, toilet seats, or baseball bats, they are what the lawyers call fungible. So why should the government pay, say, $500 for treating Jones's pneumonia and $5,000 or $50,000 for treating Smith's? Now doctors are beginning to wake up from the nightmare they have brought on themselves. However, perhaps because they have been asleep too long, they do not see very clearly. Thus, the first thing they do is wail, like frightened children, that they are innocent. In other words, that it is not their fault that different patients suffering from the same disease do not necessarily require the same length of treatment. But the physicians and politicians who have created the DRG system know that. We must therefore look for a more subtle or repressed explanation for what has happened. What I think has happened, briefly put, is this. As patients stopped and third parties started to pay doctors, doctors lost interest in pleasing the patients and became more interested in pleasing those who pay them, that is, insurance companies, regulated by the government, and the state. How do you please a patient? By making him feel better and respecting his wishes. How do you please a bureaucracy? By dramatizing and justifying the great things you are doing for your impersonal beneficiaries. This is how the American people fell into the stupor of believing that doctors treat and cure diseases. Now physicians and patients alike are discovering that that is not so. As a cancer specialist, writes a physician in the New York Times, I often see patients who are not candidates for chemotherapy, radiation treatment, or surgery, but nonetheless need hospital care. Not treating cancer is one thing, not treating a person is another. Indeed, complains the writer, a physician stupid enough to care for such a patient too conscientiously can be labeled a Medicare abuser. It does not seem to occur to this physician, or probably to other physicians and laypeople, that there may be a connection between this impending persecution of doctors who want to take care of patients as they think they ought to, and the persecution of ordinary men and women throughout the world who want to take care of their own lives as they think they ought to. Physicians have eagerly embraced the practice of labeling people as drug abusers, wife abusers, child abusers, and the abusers of everything else in sight, even though these persons were not sick, were not their patients, and wanted to have nothing to do with the medical profession. Now, it is the physician's turn to be stigmatized and persecuted for trying to help patients, just as they have stigmatized and persecuted people who have tried to help themselves. After all, can we be sure that helping others by bankrupting the economy is any less dangerous than helping oneself by ingesting chemicals? a medical profession prostituted to the state calls dangerous? In vain will doctors try to use the word help once their adversaries have taken control of the vocabulary. The doctor's duty is clear. He must ensure that American medicine assumes responsibility for dealing with the plague of Medicare abuse threatening the nation. Accordingly, psychiatrists must immediately organize clinics and hospitals for the treatment of patients afflicted with Medicare abuse. Surely, we cannot permit sick doctors, harboring the delusion that their duty is to treat patients instead of diseases, to endanger the health and well-being of the American people. Toward a more candid identification of the medical situation. Perhaps the time is approaching when a suggestion I made some 20 years ago might be timely. I then proposed that the psychiatrist's social position vis-à-vis his client should be clearly defined. Does he represent the interests of the patient, as defined by the patient, or of others, the patient's family, society, and so forth? This division of functions would reflect the fact that the practicing psychiatrist is usually the agent of one party and the antagonist of another. I advocate a clear social recognition and professional codification of this situation. The psychiatric patient has long been a party in conflict with other parties, but was treated nevertheless as if he simply had a disease. Of course, he is still so treated. Now the physician is being forced to become a party in conflict with other parties, but is expected to act as if he were simply treating diseases. This situation is bound to get worse before it gets better. Why? Because I believe it can get better only if we are willing to recognize what we have not been willing to recognize, namely, who controls the medical transaction, how it is controlled, and what its real aims are. Such recognition would require heretofore unseen candor, as well as genuine medical, economic, and political self-disclosure on the parts of doctors, insurance carriers, and politicians. Then, and only then, could we articulate and acknowledge certain already existing categories of medical practice, such as the following: scientific medicine, for medicine under the control of the medical profession; police medicine, for medicine in the service of the police; executionary and military medicine, for medicine used for killing; forensic medicine, for medicine in the interests of litigants and law enforcement; entrepreneurial medicine, for medicine as a free trade; socialized medicine, for medicine as a state-supported and controlled trade; professional medicine, for medicine as a profession in the traditional sense of that word, and so forth. After all, it is folly to ignore the proverbial warning that he who pays the piper calls the tune. A comparison of human medicine with veterinary medicine makes clear the danger that threatens us. From the descriptive point of view, the difference between the physician and the veterinarian is that the former treats human diseases or sick people, whereas the latter treats animal diseases or sick animals. From the moral and political point of view, the difference between them is that the physician is expected to be the agent of the persons who are his patients, whereas the veterinarian is expected to be the agent of persons who own sick animals. In proportion, then, as the physician becomes the agent of the state, and in proportion as the state is totalitarian, the physician becomes, from a moral and political point of view, a veterinarian, that is, the agent of a state that owns its citizens, just as the farmer owns his animals. This is why killing animals is part of the normal function of the veterinarian, and why incarcerating people is, and killing them may yet become, a part of the normal function of the physician employed by the therapeutic state.